There are certain nights in history that entire communities agree never to speak of again. Nights so disturbing that generations later, the descendants still refuse to acknowledge what happened. In the cotton parishes of central Alabama, there exists one such night, May 23, 1852, when the bodies of 17 people were discovered at the Yancey plantation before dawn. The local magistrate's report, sealed for 73 years, contained details so shocking that when it was finally opened in 1925, 3 historians immediately petitioned to have it resealed. What made this case particularly horrifying wasn't just the number of dead, but the carefully documented evidence suggesting that everything began with 2 sisters who should have been identical in every way, yet competed for the same man, a man they legally owned. Before we continue with the story of the Yancey twins and the night that would be known only as the catastrophe in whispered conversations for the next century, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by the darkest corners of American history, the stories they tried to bury, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And in the comments, tell me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know how far these forgotten stories are reaching. Now let's uncover what really happened on that blood-soaked May night in Alabama. The truth about the Yancey plantation had been carefully hidden, but the evidence, court documents, personal letters, and testimonies from neighboring plantations tells a story far more disturbing than any legend. The Yancey plantation sat on 1,100 acres of prime cotton land along the banks of the Alabama River, just northwest of Montgomery. The columned mansion, with its wraparound veranda and imported French windows, represented everything the South aspired to be in those final years before the world would tear itself apart. The property had belonged to the Yancey family since 1798. Passed down through 4 generations of men who built their fortune on cotton and the labor of the 143 enslaved people who worked the fields, the gin house, and the mansion itself. In 1848, when Cornelius Yancey died of cholera during an epidemic that swept through the Tennessee Valley, he left behind a peculiar inheritance situation that would become the talk of Montgomery society. His twin daughters, Caroline and Catherine, 23 years old and unmarried, inherited the entire estate in equal shares. Their mother had died giving birth to them, and Cornelius had never remarried, pouring all his ambitions into his daughters and his land. The twins were identical in appearance. Both had dark auburn hair they wore in elaborate braids, pale skin that required parasols and wide-brimmed hats, and green eyes that seemed to change shade depending on their mood. They stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, unusually tall for women of their era, and their voices held the same soft drawl that could harden into command when addressing the enslaved workers or household staff. But where they were identical in appearance, they were opposites in temperament, a fact that everyone in Dallas County would eventually come to understand with terrible clarity. Caroline, born 23 minutes before her sister, had inherited their father's business acumen and his iron will. She kept the plantation books, negotiated cotton prices with factors in Montgomery and Mobile, and ran the estate with calculated precision. She attended the Methodist Church in Cahaba every Sunday, served on the Ladies' Auxiliary, and maintained all the proper social connections that kept a plantation functioning in Alabama society. Her ledgers were immaculate, her correspondence formal and precise, her reputation unblemished. Catherine, by contrast, had inherited something else entirely, a wild streak that polite society whispered about behind fans and over tea. She read scandalous French novels that she ordered from New Orleans, rode her horse alone through the countryside without a chaperone, and showed little interest in the marriage proposals that came regularly from sons of other plantation families. She spent hours in the gardens, claimed to find organized religion stifling, and often disappeared for long walks along the river. Where Caroline controlled, Catherine questioned. Where Caroline preserved tradition, Catherine pushed against boundaries. For 4 years after their father's death, this delicate balance held. Caroline managed the business, Catherine managed the household. and the Yancey plantation continued to produce its quota of cotton bales each season. The enslaved population worked the fields under the supervision of an overseer named Virgil Henley, a hard man from Georgia who carried a whip and maintained discipline through fear and punishment, as was common on plantations throughout the Black Belt. But in the spring of 1852, something shifted in the careful equilibrium of the Yancey estate. It began, as these things often did, with something that seemed inconsequential at the time. On March 15, 1852, Caroline purchased a man at the Montgomery slave market. His name was Samuel, and he came with papers indicating he had been born in Virginia, sold south at age 19, and had spent the last 6 years working in the port of Mobile. He was 27 years old, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, and possessed what the auctioneer's bill of sale described as an unusually refined manner of speech and exceptional literacy. The last detail was what had caught Caroline's attention. Literate slaves were rare and valuable. They could manage complex tasks, keep records, understand written instructions. Caroline had been looking for someone to help manage the household inventories and assist with correspondence, particularly during the busy harvest season when her time was consumed with cotton calculations and shipping arrangements. She paid $1,200 for Samuel, a significant sum that raised eyebrows among other bidders. What Caroline didn't know, what no one knew until much later, was that Catherine had accompanied her sister to Montgomery that day, and had seen Samuel on the auction block before Caroline made her bid, had noticed the way he held himself despite the degradation of being displayed for purchase, had observed his eyes, dark and intelligent, scanning the crowd with barely concealed contempt for the proceedings, had felt something she'd never felt before, standing in that crowd of men in black coats and women with parasols, watching human beings sold like cattle. Samuel arrived at the Yancey plantation on March 18th. Virgil Henley wanted to send him to the fields immediately. Field hands were always needed, especially strong young men who could work from sunup to sundown. But Caroline overruled him. Samuel would work in the house, she insisted. He would assist with correspondence, inventory management, and the complex record-keeping required to run an estate of this size. The decision caused immediate friction. Henley, who had run the Yancey plantation's labor force for 6 years with brutal efficiency, didn't trust educated slaves. They gave the others ideas, he argued. They caused unrest. But Caroline held firm. She owned half this plantation, and she would decide how her property was utilized. For the first 2 weeks, Samuel performed his duties exactly as expected. He was deferential, quick to understand instructions, meticulous in his work. He helped Caroline organize shipping manifests, copied letters in a neat hand that suggested formal education somewhere in his past, and maintained the household inventory lists with impressive accuracy. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his eyes downcast in the presence of white people, and showed none of the insolence that Henley constantly warned about. But Catherine watched him, from the windows of the upper floor, from the doorway of the drawing room, from her seat on the veranda in the late afternoon. She watched the way he moved through the house, the way his jaw tightened when Henley barked orders, the way his hands, calloused but careful, held the pen when he wrote. She began finding excuses to be wherever he was working, asking questions about the inventory, requesting his assistance with moving furniture or retrieving books from high shelves. It was Catherine who first spoke to him as if he were a person rather than property. It happened on April 2nd in the library where Samuel was cataloguing the contents of the Yancey book collection. Catherine entered, closed the door behind her, something she should never have done, something that violated every social code of the plantation South, and asked him a question that would change everything. "Can you read these?" she asked, gesturing to the shelves of books. "Or just copy the titles?" Samuel looked up, clearly uncertain how to respond. The question itself was dangerous. Admitting to full literacy could be seen as threatening. But something in Catherine's expression, genuine curiosity rather than malice, made him answer honestly. "I can read them, miss. My first owner's wife taught me when I was young. She was a Quaker from Pennsylvania who believed differently about such things." Catherine pulled a book from the shelf. Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, a French novel that had recently been translated into English. What's this one about? And Samuel, in direct violation of every survival instinct that had kept him alive in a world designed to destroy him, began to tell her about Quasimodo and Esmeralda, about sanctuary and persecution, about the nature of true ugliness versus true beauty. Catherine listened, sitting on the edge of the library table, her elaborate day dress spreading around her like a flower, while an enslaved man spoke to her about literature and philosophy as if they were equals. This scene repeated itself over the following weeks. Catherine would find Samuel alone, ensure they wouldn't be interrupted, and they would talk. About books at first, then about music, about the world beyond Dallas County, about ideas and dreams and thoughts that couldn't exist within the rigid hierarchy of plantation life. Catherine had never had conversations like these, not with her sister, who thought only of profit and propriety, not with the simpering sons of planters who courted her, not with anyone. For the first time in her life, someone listened to her thoughts as if they mattered, challenged her ideas, made her think beyond the boundaries of her privileged existence. For Samuel, these conversations were something else entirely. They were dangerous, potentially fatal. Every word he spoke was a risk. Every moment alone with a white woman was a threat. One accusation, one misunderstood gesture, and he would be killed. No trial, no questions, just a rope and a tree. He knew this absolutely. Yet he continued to meet with Catherine, continued to speak honestly with her, because in those stolen moments in the library or the garden house or the tack room of the stable, he could briefly exist as something other than property. By late April, their conversations had evolved into something that couldn't be called mere intellectual exchange. They had become intimate in ways that transcended physical touch, though that barrier, too, would eventually fall. Catherine found herself thinking about Samuel constantly, arranging her days around moments when she might see him alone, lying awake at night replaying their conversations. For a woman raised in a society that taught her to see enslaved people as less than human, as tools or children incapable of complex thought, these feelings created a cognitive dissonance that she couldn't resolve. How could she feel this way about someone she was supposed to own? Caroline noticed the change in her sister, the distraction, the sudden interest in household management that brought Catherine into contact with Samuel more frequently, the way Catherine's mood would brighten when Samuel was present. At first, Caroline attributed it to boredom, to Catherine's restless nature finding a new curiosity. But Caroline was observant, meticulous in her attention to detail, and she began to watch more carefully. On May 1st, Caroline was working in the plantation office, reviewing shipping contracts, when she needed Samuel to verify an inventory count. She sent a house girl to fetch him, but he couldn't be found. For 30 minutes, Samuel was unaccounted for. When he finally appeared, apologizing for the delay and explaining he'd been searching for a missing ledger in the attic storage, Caroline noticed something that made her blood run cold. A piece of straw in his hair, the kind that came from the stable loft, and a flush to his skin that suggested exertion or something else entirely. That evening, Caroline made an excuse to visit the stable, something about checking on her horse's feeding schedule. In the loft, she found evidence that someone had been there recently. A blanket spread over the hay, a book left behind, one of Catherine's French novels. The pieces came together with horrible clarity. Her sister, her identical twin, was conducting an affair with a slave. An affair that, if discovered, would destroy them both. Catherine would be ruined, cast out from society. The plantation would be seized, and Samuel would be killed, probably tortured first as an example to the other enslaved workers. Caroline's first instinct was horror, her second was rage, and her third was something she didn't expect and couldn't fully acknowledge even to herself: jealousy. Not because she cared about maintaining racial hierarchies or property boundaries, but because she had begun to notice Samuel too. His intelligence, his dignity despite his circumstances, the way he handled the complex work she gave him with effortless competence. She had told herself these were merely professional appreciations, the satisfaction of having found a valuable asset. But seeing evidence of Catherine's secret life with Samuel forced Caroline to confront feelings she had been suppressing for weeks. That night, Caroline did something she would later regret for the rest of her life. Instead of confronting Catherine, instead of sending Samuel away or reporting the situation to authorities, she decided to compete. The next week transformed the Yancey plantation into a pressure cooker of jealousy, manipulation, and barely concealed desperation. Caroline began manufacturing reasons to keep Samuel working late in the office, going over accounts that didn't need reviewing, asking him to teach her his method of organization. She started dressing more carefully when she knew she would see him, wearing her hair differently, speaking to him with a softness that was utterly unlike her usual crisp efficiency. Samuel recognized the danger immediately. Two white women, twin sisters who owned him, both showing interests that could only end in catastrophe. He tried to withdraw, to become invisible again, to revert to the submissive mask that kept enslaved people alive. But Caroline had power over his daily existence. She could assign him tasks, keep him late, send him on errands that ensured they were alone together. And Catherine, increasingly aware of her sister's attention to Samuel, became more reckless in her attempts to see him, more open in her affection, more desperate to claim what she saw as hers. On May 8th, Caroline did something extraordinary. She called Samuel into the office late at night, after the house staff had retired, and she locked the door. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, and Samuel stood frozen, certain this was the moment his life would end. Then Caroline spoke, her voice shaking slightly. The first time Samuel had ever heard uncertainty in her tone. "My sister has been meeting with you, in the stable. Don't deny it, I have evidence." She paused, watching his face carefully. "I could have you whipped until you can't stand. I could sell you south to the sugar plantations where you'd be dead within 2 years. I could report this to the sheriff and watch you hang." Another pause, longer this time. "Or I could offer you something different." What Caroline proposed in that locked office was a transaction that revealed both the absolute corruption of the slavery system and the desperate measures a lonely, isolated woman might take. She would protect him from punishment for his involvement with Catherine. She would ensure his safety, improve his living conditions, perhaps even, she hinted carefully, consider his future freedom. In exchange, he would transfer his attentions to her. He would meet with her as he had met with Catherine. He would, in essence, become shared property between the twin sisters, though Caroline made clear she expected to be the primary beneficiary of the arrangement. Samuel had no choice, and both of them knew it. His consent was purchased with the threat of death and the faint hope of survival. He agreed to Caroline's terms because the alternative was unthinkable. For the next 2 weeks, Samuel found himself caught in an impossible situation. Catherine, unaware of Caroline's ultimatum, continued to seek him out, to speak with him in hushed voices about running away together, about freedom, about a life beyond Alabama that could never exist. Caroline, meanwhile, summoned him to the office with increasing frequency, demanding his attention, his time, his body. The careful distance she had initially maintained, the pretense of propriety, gradually eroded. She touched his hand when reviewing ledgers. She stood too close when discussing inventory. She made comments that were unmistakably personal rather than professional. The other enslaved workers in the house noticed, of course. They saw Samuel's increasing exhaustion, the tension that radiated from him, the way both white women watched him constantly. They whispered among themselves about the danger brewing, about how these situations always ended in blood. Old Dinah, who had worked in the Yancey house for 40 years, pulled Samuel aside in early May and spoke with the blunt honesty of someone who had seen too much tragedy. "Whatever's happening between you and those women, it's going to kill you," she said flatly. "White women and colored men, it always ends the same way. You need to do something wrong. Get yourself sold away before this explodes." But Samuel couldn't see a way out. If he tried to run, the dogs would find him within days. If he deliberately sabotaged his work to get sold, he might end up somewhere worse. And despite everything, despite the danger, despite the manipulation, despite the fundamental wrongness of the entire situation, he had developed genuine feelings for Catherine. Not the complicated mixture of fear and obligation he felt toward Caroline, but real affection for the woman who had first seen him as human, who had risked everything to speak with him as an equal. Catherine, meanwhile, had begun to realize her sister was also involved with Samuel. She noticed the way Caroline's eyes followed him, the way she found excuses to keep him working late, the subtle changes in Caroline's behavior. What should have been a warning instead ignited Catherine's competitive nature. The sisters had always competed, for their father's approval, for social status, for everything. Now they were competing for Samuel, and neither seemed capable of recognizing how grotesque and dangerous the situation had become. On May 15th, Catherine confronted Samuel in the garden house, her voice sharp with accusation. "You've been spending time with Caroline, I can see it. Has she touched you?" Samuel's silence was answer enough. Catherine's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "She doesn't care about you. She sees you as property, an asset to exploit. I'm the one who sees you as a person. I'm the one who would risk everything for you." "Miss Catherine," Samuel said carefully, using the formal address because even in private moments, the power dynamic could never be forgotten. "With respect, you can't risk what I risk. If this comes out, you'll be socially ruined. I'll be dead. Those aren't equivalent consequences." The truth of this statement hung between them. Catherine wanted to argue, to insist her feelings made them equals, but she couldn't. The plantation system that had given her wealth and status had also made true equality between them impossible. She could sympathize, she could rebel against the strictures of her society, but she couldn't change the fundamental reality that she was free and he was not, that her worst nightmare was exile from polite society, while his was death. "Then let's leave," Catherine said suddenly, desperately. "We'll go north. I have jewelry I can sell. We'll get to Pennsylvania or Ohio. You'll be free there." "We can—" "They'll chase us," Samuel interrupted quietly. "Your sister won't let her property disappear. The sheriff will form a posse. They'll bring dogs. And when they catch us, when, not if, I'll hang, and you'll be brought back in disgrace. Is that what you want?" Catherine had no answer. Her romantic vision of escape crumbled against the reality Samuel understood all too well. But instead of accepting defeat, her desperation deepened. If they couldn't leave, then she would find another way to claim what she saw as hers. That night, Catherine did something that would set the final tragedy in motion. She went to Caroline's bedroom and confronted her sister directly. The argument that followed was later recounted by Rose, a housegirl who overheard it from the hallway while bringing up evening tea. The twins' voices rose steadily, though the words were initially muffled. Then suddenly Catherine's voice became clear and carrying. "You don't care about him. You just can't stand that I have something you don't." Caroline's response was colder, sharper. "I'm protecting you from your own stupidity. If I don't control this situation, people will find out. Do you want to see him lynched? Because that's what will happen when one of the field hands talks, when Henley notices, when any of our neighbors get suspicious. You're not protecting anyone but yourself. You want him because I want him. That's all this has ever been. Competing with me. Don't be ridiculous. He's property. Don't you dare." Catherine's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Don't you dare pretend this is about property management. I see how you look at him. I know what you're doing in that office late at night." There was a long silence. Then Caroline spoke, and Rose would later swear that she had never heard such coldness in a human voice. "Fine. You want to know the truth? Yes, I want him. Yes, I've taken him. And unlike you with your childish romantic fantasies, I understand what he actually is. Mine. My property, purchased with my money to use as I see fit. You can play at being in love if it makes you feel better, but at the end of the day, I own him. You own him. He doesn't get a choice in this. That's the reality you're too foolish to accept. Then we'll see who he chooses when given the chance," Catherine said. "We'll ask him, directly, and we'll both honor his decision." Caroline laughed, a bitter sound. "You can't free a slave by asking his preference. The world doesn't work that way." "Then I'll free him. Legally, I'll draw up manumission papers tomorrow." "You'll do no such thing," Caroline said flatly. "You own half this plantation. I own half. That means you own half of Samuel. You can't free him without my consent, and I don't give it. He stays enslaved. He stays here. And if you try to change that, I'll have him sold so far south you'll never see him again." The argument deteriorated from there, devolving into accusations and old grievances. Years of sibling rivalry suddenly focused on one man who had no power in the situation at all. Finally, Catherine stormed from the room, slamming the door hard enough to shake the house. The following morning, May 16th, Samuel was conspicuously absent from his usual duties. Carolyn sent 3 different houseworkers to find him, each returning with the same message. He wasn't in his quarters, wasn't in the stable, wasn't anywhere on the property they could see. Virgil Henley was summoned, and a search was organized, plantation workers combing through the fields, the woods along the river, the outbuildings. They found Samuel in the old cotton gin house, a building that hadn't been used since a newer gin was constructed the previous year. He was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, staring at nothing. When Henley grabbed him roughly and demanded to know why he'd abandoned his duties, Samuel didn't respond. He simply stood when pulled to his feet and allowed himself to be marched back to the main house without speaking a word. Caroline saw him in this state and felt something crack in her carefully controlled demeanor. She dismissed Henley and the others, then approached Samuel in the plantation office where he'd been left standing. "What's wrong with you? Why did you disappear?" Samuel looked at her, and Caroline would later tell the magistrate that his eyes held something she'd never seen in an enslaved person before. Not hatred, not fear, but complete resignation. "You can't force someone to choose between 2 people who own them," he said quietly. "There's no choice in that, just survival." "We're not forcing," Caroline started, but Samuel cut her off, a boldness that would have gotten him whipped on most plantations. "Yes, you are, both of you. Miss Catherine thinks she's different because she talks to me like a person, but she still owns me. You think you're practical and honest about it, but you still own me. And now you're both angry because your property isn't behaving the way you want." He paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue, then clearly deciding he had nothing left to lose. "I can't be part of this anymore. I won't be. Sell me, whip me, kill me, I don't care, but I won't keep doing this." For a long moment, Caroline stared at him. Then, surprisingly, her expression softened into something almost like regret. "You're right," she said quietly. "This has become impossible. I'll arrange to sell you to a factor in Mobile. You'll be processed through and resold elsewhere. It's the safest option for everyone." But Catherine, who had been listening from the hallway, burst into the room. "You will not sell him. I won't allow it." "You don't have a choice," Caroline said, her voice hardening again. "I own half of him. That gives me the power to force a sale if I believe the asset has become disruptive to plantation operations. Any magistrate would agree with me." What happened next was documented by multiple witnesses. Catherine, in her desperation, made an offer that was both legally dubious and socially catastrophic. She proposed that she and Caroline divide all plantation assets, each taking complete ownership of their portion. Catherine would take Samuel as part of her share, free him immediately through manumission papers, and then marry him. They would leave Alabama, go north where such marriages were recognized in some states, and never return. The silence that followed this announcement was absolute. The 2 houseworkers present, Rose and a young man named Isaac, stood frozen, understanding they were witnessing something that could get everyone in the room killed. Caroline's response was carefully controlled. "You've lost your mind. That proposal is illegal, immoral, and would destroy both of us. The answer is no." "Then I'll take this to court," Catherine said. "I'll petition for division of property. You'll what?" Caroline interrupted. "Tell a judge you want to free and marry a slave? They'll commit you to an asylum for insanity. Or worse, they'll investigate why you're so attached to this particular piece of property, and then Samuel dies. Is that what you want? Catherine had no answer to this. She stood trembling with rage and helplessness, tears streaming down her face while her sister watched with an expression of pity and contempt. Samuel, caught between them, made a decision. "I'll choose," he said suddenly. "You want me to choose? I'll choose. Then this ends." Both sisters turned to look at him. "What?" Caroline said. "You asked me to choose between you." "I choose Miss Catherine. She's the one who first saw me as human. If my choice means anything, if there's any possibility of something other than being property forever, I choose her." For a moment, hope flared in Catherine's eyes. Then Caroline smiled, a cold, terrible expression. "Your choice means nothing. You're a slave. You don't get to choose." Catherine stepped forward, her hand moving to her dress pocket, where she'd placed a small pistol earlier that morning. A weapon she'd taken from her father's study, intending to use it to protect herself and Samuel if they tried to run. Her hand closed around it, and in that moment she genuinely considered shooting her sister. Caroline saw the movement, recognized the shape of the weapon through the fabric, and her face went pale. "Catherine, don't." "Give me ownership of Samuel," Catherine said, her voice shaking. "Sign over your half to me, now." "If you shoot me, you'll hang," Caroline said, "and Samuel will still be sold. Henley or the sheriff will ensure it. You can't win this way." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. Then Samuel spoke, his voice utterly calm. "Miss Catherine, put the gun away. Please, nothing good comes from this." Catherine looked at him, saw something in his expression, pleading or perhaps wisdom, and slowly removed her hand from her pocket, empty. The moment of potential violence passed, but the damage was done. Everyone present knew how close they'd come to murder. Caroline straightened her dress, her composure returning though her hands shook slightly. "I'm going to Montgomery tomorrow to speak with our lawyer about formally selling Samuel. This situation has become untenable. He'll be gone within a week." Catherine turned and walked from the room without another word. Samuel remained standing where he was, and Caroline couldn't quite meet his eyes as she told him to return to his quarters and remain there until she decided what to do with him. That evening, the entire social structure of the Yancey plantation began to fracture. Word of the confrontation spread through the enslaved quarters with the speed that gossip always travels when people's lives depend on reading the moods and tensions of those who hold power over them. The field workers, who had been kept separate from the house drama until now, learned that two white women were fighting over a house slave, that guns had been drawn, that everything was falling apart. Virgil Henley heard the whispers and understood immediately how dangerous the situation had become. Enslaved workers who witnessed white people losing control, who saw the power structure destabilizing, might get ideas, might start thinking about rebellion or escape, might realize that the system that held them in bondage was more fragile than it appeared. Henley called a meeting with Caroline that evening, insisting something had to be done immediately. "That man needs to be made an example," Henley told Caroline in her office. "The others are watching. They're seeing weakness, seeing division. You need to reassert control." "I'm selling him," Caroline said. "That resolves the issue." "Not quickly enough. He should be whipped. Tonight. Publicly. Send a message that insubordination gets punished." Caroline hesitated. She knew Henley was right from a plantation management perspective. Maintaining discipline through fear was standard practice. But the thought of ordering Samuel whipped, after everything that had passed between them, made her feel sick. "No," she said finally, "we'll handle this my way." Henley's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, both you and your sister. This is what happens when women try to run plantations without a man's firm hand." The condescension in his voice sparked Caroline's anger. "You're dismissed, Mr. Henley. I'll call you if I need your services." After Henley left, Caroline sat alone in the office trying to determine her next move. She had lost control of the situation, something she prided herself on never allowing. Her carefully ordered world was crumbling because she had let emotion override reason, because she had competed with her sister over a man who wasn't even free, because she had violated every principle she claimed to hold about property and propriety and the proper social order. While Caroline wrestled with her choices, Catherine was in her bedroom writing a letter. She had decided in the wake of the confrontation that if she couldn't free Samuel through legal channels, she would help him escape. She would provide money, supplies, information about the Underground Railroad contacts she'd heard whispered about in Montgomery's more radical circles. She would sacrifice everything, her inheritance, her position, her family, to give him a chance at freedom. In her letter, she detailed her plan. Samuel would leave that very night, heading north through the woods toward Selma, where a Quaker family was rumored to shelter runaways. Catherine would create a distraction, claim Samuel had attacked her, give him enough of a head start that the pursuing party might lose the trail. It was a desperate, poorly conceived plan with almost no chance of success. But Catherine had moved beyond rational thought into the realm of romantic martyrdom. She saw herself as the heroine of one of her French novels, sacrificing everything for love, defying society's cruel laws. She didn't fully grasp, or chose to ignore, that her sacrifice wouldn't save Samuel, would likely only ensure his death was more drawn out and painful when he was inevitably recaptured. Catherine sent word to Samuel through Rose, asking him to meet her in the garden house at midnight. The message included instructions to bring nothing, to tell no one, to be ready to leave forever. Samuel received this message in his quarters, a small room he shared with 2 other houseworkers. He read Catherine's note, written in her elaborate script on expensive paper, and felt despair settle over him like a weight. He understood what Catherine could not or would not accept. Escape was impossible. The plantation dogs would track him within hours. Every white person in the county would be watching for a runaway slave, authorized to shoot on sight. Even if by some miracle he made it to Selma, the Quaker family might not exist, or might not risk their lives for a stranger, or might have already been discovered and arrested for aiding runaways. But Samuel also understood that if he didn't go along with Catherine's plan, she would be devastated, might do something even more reckless. And there was a small, irrational part of him that wanted to believe escape was possible, that Catherine's love could somehow overcome the brutal machinery of slavery. He spent the hours before midnight talking quietly with Isaac, the young man who worked in the house. Isaac had been born on the Yancey plantation, had known nothing but this life, and he listened to Samuel's situation with the weary wisdom of someone who had seen these dramas play out before. "These white women and their games," Isaac said, shaking his head. "They think they can control everything, including how we feel. Miss Catherine acts like she's doing you a favor, like helping you run is noble. But when you get caught, and you will get caught, she'll be safe in this house while you're being torn apart by dogs or hanging from a tree." "I know," Samuel said quietly. "But what choice do I have? If I refuse her plan, I'm still being sold away. If I try to run, at least there's a chance." "A tiny chance, but a chance." Isaac considered this. "There's always another choice. The choice enslaved people have always had when pushed too far." Samuel understood what Isaac meant without him saying it directly. Resistance, not escape, not submission, but direct confrontation with the system itself. It was a choice that always ended in death, but sometimes people reached a point where death on their own terms seemed preferable to continued degradation. "I'm not ready for that," Samuel said. "None of us are," Isaac replied. "Until suddenly we are." As midnight approached, the Yancey plantation settled into uneasy silence. Caroline, exhausted from the day's confrontations, had finally fallen asleep in her bedroom, though her rest was troubled by dreams of conflict and loss. Catherine lay awake, dressed in dark clothes suitable for riding, a packed bag beside her bed. She had decided to go with Samuel after all, had convinced herself their love could overcome any obstacle. Virgil Henley sat in his cottage near the slave quarters, drinking whiskey and cleaning his pistol, convinced that everything happening at the plantation was the result of weak female leadership. And Samuel prepared to meet Catherine, to participate in her doomed plan because he had run out of better options. What none of them knew was that Rose, the house girl who had been carrying messages between the sisters and Samuel, had become increasingly frightened by what she was witnessing. Rose had a husband in the quarters, had children she was terrified of losing if the plantation fell apart or was sold. She had seen what happened when white people's conflicts spilled over onto enslaved workers. Everyone suffered, the guilty and innocent alike. So Rose made a decision that would determine the fate of everyone at the Yancey plantation. She told Virgil Henley everything. About the affair, about both sisters competing for Samuel, about the escape plan Catherine had arranged for that very night. Henley listened to Rose's whispered account in his cottage, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he stood abruptly. "Go back to your quarters. Say nothing to anyone about this conversation. If anyone asks, you've been asleep all evening." Rose fled, terrified she had made everything worse. Henley, meanwhile, began to make his own plans. He understood that what was happening at the Yancey plantation was beyond his ability to control through normal disciplinary measures. The situation required more drastic intervention. He would gather a group of trusted men, overseers from neighboring plantations, men he'd worked with before, men who understood how to handle situations when enslaved people got uppity or when white women needed to be protected from their own foolishness. They would catch Samuel in the act of running, would deal with him in the permanent way that served as a message to every other enslaved person in Dallas County, and they would quietly ensure the Yancey sisters understood the consequences of losing control. At 11:45 p.m. on May 22, 1852, Samuel left his quarters and began walking toward the garden house. The night was humid, moonless, the air thick with the scent of magnolia and the distant promise of rain. He moved quietly past the main house, past the dark windows where Caroline slept, toward the small building where Catherine waited. He didn't know that Henley and 6 other men were already positioned in the shadows, watching his approach. He didn't know that Caroline had woken from a nightmare and was even now standing at her bedroom window, watching the grounds with a feeling of dread she couldn't explain. He didn't know that what he thought was a private escape attempt was actually walking directly into an ambush that would end in catastrophe. Samuel reached the garden house and pushed open the door. Catherine stood inside, a lantern in her hand casting golden light across her face. She smiled when she saw him, a smile of hope and determination and desperation. "You came," she whispered. "I was afraid you wouldn't come." "I came," Samuel replied. And then, because some part of him needed her to understand the reality of what they were attempting, "But Miss Catherine, you need to know, this won't work. We won't make it. This ends badly no matter what happens next." Catherine stepped closer to him, close enough that the lantern light caught the tears in her eyes. "Then let it end badly together. Let us at least try." Before Samuel could respond, before Catherine could say anything more, the garden house door crashed open. Virgil Henley stood in the entrance, pistol in hand, 6 other men behind him carrying rifles and torches. The sudden light was blinding after the darkness, and for a moment, everyone froze in a tableau that captured the essential cruelty of the moment. An enslaved man and a white woman caught in an embrace, surrounded by armed men representing every structure of power that made their relationship both possible and forbidden. "Step away from her," Henley ordered, his voice cold and final. "Step away right now or I'll shoot you where you stand." Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in that garden house would escalate beyond anyone's imagination. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Alabama's darkest night. Samuel raised his hands slowly, stepping back from Catherine. Henley gestured with his pistol for Samuel to move toward the door, toward the waiting men. "Catherine, her face pale with horror, suddenly stepped between them. "No, you can't take him. I invited him here. This is my fault, not his." "Miss Catherine, you need to go back to the house," Henley said, his voice holding a warning. "This doesn't concern you anymore. We're dealing with a slave who attempted to assault you. That's what happened here. That's what everyone will say happened. He didn't assault me. I asked him to come here. You're confused," Henley interrupted, and now there was menace in his tone, traumatized by his attack. "Now go to the house before you say something you'll regret." Catherine understood in that moment what Henley was planning. They would kill Samuel and claim he'd attacked her. They would frame everything as a simple case of a slave getting violent with a white woman. A story that required no investigation, no questions, just swift and brutal justice. She turned to the other men, recognizing several of them from neighboring plantations. "Listen to me, all of you. I invited him here. I care about him. If you hurt him, you'll answer to me." One of the men, an overseer named Cutler from the adjoining property, laughed harshly. "Miss, with respect, you don't seem to understand your situation. What we witnessed here is a capital crime. That man was alone with you in the dark. That's all a jury needs to hear. Now you can either go quietly back to the house and let us handle this, or we can tell people you were complicit. Your choice." The threat was clear. Cooperate with their version of events, or be destroyed along with Samuel. Catherine looked at Samuel, saw his resigned expression, saw that he understood this moment had been inevitable from the beginning. Their relationship had existed in a space that the plantation system couldn't tolerate, and now that system was reasserting itself with violence. "Run," Catherine said suddenly to Samuel. "Run now. I'll stop them." It was a foolish suggestion, born of desperation rather than strategy. Samuel couldn't outrun bullets, couldn't escape men on horses with dogs. But before anyone could respond, a voice cut through the tension from outside the garden house. "What is happening here?" Caroline stood in the doorway, wrapped in a nightrobe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She had followed her sense of dread from the house, had seen the torches and heard voices, and now confronted a scene that confirmed her worst fears. She took in everything at once. Catherine standing protectively in front of Samuel, Henley and his men, with weapons drawn. The damning intimacy of the setting. "Miss Caroline," Henley said, his voice taking on an explanatory tone, "we caught your property attempting to assault your sister. We were about to administer justice." Caroline looked from Henley to Catherine to Samuel, and in her face was a war between competing emotions, jealousy, fear, anger, and something that might have been regret. She could save Samuel by corroborating Catherine's story, by admitting the truth of the complicated relationship between the three of them, but doing so would destroy them all. Or she could accept Henley's version, sacrifice Samuel, and preserve the social order that gave her power and status. "That's not what happened," Catherine said, looking directly at her sister. "You know that's not what happened. Tell them, please." The moment stretched. Years later, in the testimony Caroline would give to the magistrate, she would claim she'd been trying to find words that would save everyone. But in that moment of decision, with armed men watching and her sister pleading, and Samuel standing with the dignity of someone who'd already accepted his fate, Caroline made a choice. "Mr. Henley is correct," Caroline said quietly. "Samuel has become violent and unstable. He needs to be removed from the property immediately. I'll sign whatever papers are necessary to authorize his sale to the territories." Catherine's face went white with shock and betrayal. No, you can't." "You're overwrought," Caroline said, not meeting her sister's eyes. "Go back to the house. This is a business matter now." What happened next would be debated in hushed conversations for decades. Some would later claim Catherine drew the pistol from her pocket and pointed it at her sister. Others would swear Catherine lunged at Caroline physically. A few would insist Catherine simply screamed at Caroline, calling her a traitor and a coward. But everyone agreed on what Samuel did. He stepped forward, placing himself between the sisters, his voice calm despite the terror of his situation. "Stop. Both of you. This isn't worth destroying each other over. I'm not worth destroying each other over." "You don't get to decide your worth," Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to sacrifice yourself for them." "I don't have a choice," Samuel replied. And then, looking at Carolyn with something in his expression that might have been forgiveness or might have been condemnation, "Neither do you, I suppose." Henley, tired of the drama and eager to restore order, gestured to his men. "Take him to the tree by the gin house. We'll deal with this now." The phrase "deal with this" had only one meaning in the plantation South when applied to an enslaved person accused of threatening a white woman. Caroline's face paled as she understood what Henley was proposing. "Wait, I said sell him, not—" "With respect, Miss Caroline, this situation requires immediate resolution," Henley said. "We can't wait for buyers or territory transfers. The other slaves need to see that this kind of behavior results in immediate consequences. Otherwise, we'll have chaos." Caroline opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She had set these events in motion by confirming Henley's false version of the night's events. She couldn't walk it back now without destroying her own credibility and safety. She had chosen the system over Samuel, had chosen preservation of order over mercy, and now that choice was spiraling beyond her control. Catherine, seeing her sister's hesitation, made her own choice. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Samuel, holding him in full view of everyone present. "Then you'll have to take me too. If you're going to kill him, you'll have to go through me." It was a gesture of defiance, of desperation, of love. It was also futile. Two of Henley's men stepped forward and physically pulled Catherine away from Samuel, holding her as she struggled and screamed. Another man grabbed Samuel, binding his hands with rope. "Take Miss Catherine to the house," Caroline ordered, her voice shaking. "Lock her in her room. Don't let her out until morning." As Catherine was dragged away, still screaming protests, Caroline turned to Henley. What she said next would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Do what you think is necessary, but make it quick. I don't want him to suffer." Henley nodded. And then he and his men took Samuel toward the old cotton gin house, where a large oak tree stood, a tree that had seen these scenes before, that had borne the weight of justice in the form of hemp rope and human bodies. What happened at the oak tree near the cotton gin house was, in the end, not recorded in official documents. Lynchings rarely were, particularly when they were conducted under the pretense of protecting white women from enslaved men. But the events that followed Samuel's death, the cascading violence that turned May 23, 1852 into Alabama's bloodiest night, were documented extensively because they couldn't be hidden or dismissed. Samuel died sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning. The exact moment wasn't recorded. What was recorded was that when Catherine managed to break free from her locked room, she climbed out the second-story window and dropped to the ground, breaking her ankle in the process, and limped her way to the oak tree. She found Samuel's body hanging there, still swaying slightly in the humid night air. The sound Catherine made when she saw him wasn't quite human. It was a wail of grief and rage and horror that woke half the plantation. She pulled a knife from her pocket, the same knife she'd packed for the escape attempt, intended for cutting rope or defending them on the road, and she cut Samuel down, his body falling into her arms. She held him, covered in blood from her own hands where she'd scraped them during the window escape, sobbing over his body. Caroline, hearing the screaming, rushed from the house. She found her sister collapsed on the ground, cradling Samuel, covered in blood and dirt and rocking back and forth. For a moment, the twins looked at each other across Samuel's corpse, and in that look was everything they had destroyed, their relationship, their humanity, a man's life. "What have we done?" Catherine whispered. "What have we done?" Caroline had no answer. She stood frozen, unable to approach, unable to speak, as her sister's grief poured out in waves. But the violence of that night was only beginning. The screaming had woken the enslaved quarters, and people emerged from their cabins to see what had happened. They saw Samuel's body, saw Miss Catherine covered in blood, saw Miss Caroline standing in her nightgown watching the scene. They saw Henley and his men still gathered near the tree, weapons in hand. Old Dinah, the woman who had warned Samuel about the danger he was in, walked forward slowly. She looked at Samuel's body, then at the white people who had killed him, then back at the gathered enslaved workers. When she spoke, her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. They killed him over jealousy. 2 white women fighting over a colored man, and they killed him for it. That's what this is. That's what this has always been. Henley took a step toward Dinah, raising his hand threateningly. Get back to your quarters, all of you, now. But something had broken in that moment. The usual fear, the usual obedience that kept the plantation system functioning, had fractured. Isaac, Samuel's friend from the house, picked up a shovel that had been leaning against the gin house wall. He didn't raise it, didn't threaten anyone, just held it in his hands. And that small act of potential resistance changed everything. Put that down, Henley ordered, his hand moving to his pistol. Isaac didn't put it down. Another man, a field worker named Silas, picked up a piece of firewood. Then another person armed themselves, and another, until perhaps 20 enslaved workers stood facing Henley and his men, holding improvised weapons, their faces showing a mixture of fear and fury and desperation. Caroline, seeing the situation spiraling, tried to intervene. Everyone calm down. Put down your weapons. This can still be resolved peacefully. Peacefully, Isaac said, and his voice was deadly quiet. Like how you peacefully killed Samuel. Like how you peacefully destroy all of us every day. What happened next would be disputed in later testimonies. Some said Isaac threw the first blow, striking Henley with the shovel. Others claimed one of Henley's men fired first, trying to shoot Isaac and hitting another enslaved worker instead. A few witnesses insisted Caroline stepped between the groups and was struck accidentally in the chaos. But everyone agreed on the result. Violence exploded across the plantation grounds. The fight was brief and brutal. Henley's men had guns but were outnumbered. The enslaved workers had rage and desperation, but were untrained in combat. People died on both sides, shot, beaten, stabbed with makeshift weapons. The violence spread through the quarters as more people joined the conflict, as old grievances and fresh horror combined into chaos. Catherine, still holding Samuel's body, seemed to go mad. She retrieved the pistol from her pocket, the one she had drawn on Caroline earlier, and she began shooting, not at the enslaved workers but at Henley and his men. She killed 2 of them before she was shot herself, a bullet to the chest that dropped her beside Samuel's body. Caroline, trying to stop the violence, was caught in the crossfire. She fell near her sister, their blood mingling on the Alabama dirt. The twins, identical in life, died within minutes of each other, both trying in their own flawed ways to claim or protect or possess a man they had never had the right to love in the way they had. By the time the violence ended, by the time neighboring plantations arrived with reinforcements, by the time the sheriff from Cahaba showed up with a posse, 17 people were dead. The Yancey twins, Virgil Henley and 4 of his men, Samuel, and 9 other enslaved workers who had participated in the resistance or had simply been in the wrong place when the shooting started. The Yancey plantation burned that night. Some claimed the enslaved workers set the fires deliberately in the chaos. Others said embers from dropped torches caught the cotton stores and spread. But the result was the same. The mansion, the gin house, the outbuildings, everything that represented generations of Yancey wealth, all of it was consumed by flames. In the aftermath, the official story was carefully constructed to protect what remained of social order. The magistrate's report, written 3 weeks after the events, claimed that Samuel had attempted to assault Catherine Yancey, that Virgil Henley had righteously intervened, that the enslaved workers had revolted in support of Samuel, and that the Yancey twins had died as innocent victims of slave rebellion. The report made no mention of the love triangle, the sisters' competition, or the fact that Catherine had willingly invited Samuel to meet her. Those details were too dangerous, too likely to inspire questions about the foundations of plantation society itself. The surviving enslaved workers from the Yancey plantation, more than 100 people, were sold at auction to settle the estate's debts. Families were separated, children torn from parents, the entire community scattered across the Deep South. The Yancey land was purchased by a cotton factor from Montgomery, who built a new house on the property and worked the fields with newly purchased enslaved workers who knew nothing of what had happened there. But the truth couldn't be completely suppressed. The testimonies given to the magistrate, sealed for 73 years, contained details from Rose and Isaac, who had survived, and others who had witnessed the various confrontations. When those documents were finally opened in 1925, they revealed the full, disturbing story of two sisters who had allowed jealousy and possessiveness to destroy not just themselves, but everyone around them. The story of the Yancey plantation became a cautionary tale whispered in Dallas County for generations. Not a cautionary tale about the evils of slavery, that conversation would take another century to truly begin, but rather about the dangers of women running plantations, about the importance of maintaining racial hierarchies, about what happened when unnatural relationships were allowed to develop. Only much later would historians begin to understand the real lessons of that May night, about the inherent violence of a system built on human ownership, about the impossibility of love within slavery, about the ways power corrupts even those who might otherwise be capable of compassion. Caroline and Catherine Yancey weren't villains exactly. They were products of their time and place, raised to see enslaved people as property, even as they were capable of seeing individuals like Samuel as fully human. That contradiction, being able to love someone you also believed you owned, was the fundamental sickness of the antebellum South, and it destroyed everyone it touched. Samuel's grave, if he was ever properly buried, was never marked. Neither were the graves of the other enslaved workers who died that night. The Yancey twins were interred in the Cahaba Cemetery with a shared headstone that read simply, Caroline and Catherine Yancey, beloved daughters taken too soon, 1852. The inscription mentioned nothing about how they died, nothing about what they had done, nothing about the 17 lives that ended because two women had competed for ownership of a man's affection. The oak tree near the cotton gin house survived the fire. It stood for another 60 years, bearing silent witness to what had happened beneath its branches, until a storm finally brought it down in 1912. By then, most people had forgotten the details of the catastrophe, remembered only that something terrible had happened at the old Yancey place, something people didn't talk about. But the descendants of those who were there, both white and black, though their memories were told in very different ways, kept the story alive in fragments and whispers. And every May 23rd, some of those descendants still remember the night when jealousy, love, and the cruelty of slavery combined into Alabama's bloodiest tragedy. A night when 17 people died because two sisters couldn't accept that you cannot own another person's heart, no matter how completely you own their body. This mystery shows us that the darkest chapters of American history aren't always the ones in textbooks. Sometimes they're the stories communities agreed to bury, the nights too horrifying to acknowledge, the truths too uncomfortable to face. What do you think of this story? Do you believe jealousy and love could really lead to such tragedy? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten history like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates the dark truths hidden in America's past. Until the next story, remember, the most terrifying history is the history we chose to forget.